If your city wants to legalize lounges for people to consume cannabis the way they consume alcohol in bars, are they imitating Amsterdam or creating a health hazard? That's the question I want to look at today. My name is Mike Hayes here in Colorado, the home of legal cannabis, and here on my channel we do news, commentary, and interviews from around the cannabis industry. Subscribe below or like the video, I really appreciate it. So join me now as I take a look at this op-ed in the Colorado Sun. Let's start with the title. It says, Denver's marijuana hospitality proposal would create a health hazard for workers and the public. Do not roll back hard-won local public health protections by allowing for marijuana smoking and vaping indoors. So let's start with the basics. First, I just had to ask, who is making this argument? Are they anti-cannabis activists? Are they pro-drug war activists? I will give them credit. After I looked deeper into it, it seems like they are legitimately anti-smoking advocates from a range of public health organizations. We've got the American Lung Association, we have Americans for Non-Smokers' Rights, American Heart Association. So we're going to take it at face value that these people writing this op-ed are legitimately concerned about the health effects. And I prefer that. I would rather have that conversation with well-meaning health advocates than trying to talk to drug war advocates who are always kind of trying to argue in bad faith. So what are they actually arguing in this op-ed? They're against indoor smoking at cannabis hospitality establishments. Denver is looking like they're getting really close to licensing and legalizing these kind of hospitality smokers lounges. So this op-ed is coming out to say to the Denver City Council, you shouldn't pass this bill, which is getting pretty close, the bill to enact marijuana hospitality program. If passed, they say it's going to allow marijuana smoking indoors, and they don't want that to happen. Fair enough. Let's try to understand a little bit more about their argument. So first we need to understand a little more about the context and the background here in Denver. You might think we already have had these kind of establishments where you could smoke cannabis indoors or in public. That's not true, right? So the history here is there have been gray market lounges, kind of in the middle between black market and legal. Many of them operated in kind of a gray area, right? So when I first moved here, I used to go to this establishment that was in the back of a clothing shop. It was called Grassroots California. They had dab rigs that you could rent. It was kind of expensive. It was pretty cool. It was 2014. I was pretty excited about it. They got evicted by their landlord after the police came in on 420. You also, if you visited Denver or you live here, you might have seen this Looper bus that was going around Denver. Apparently they closed down due to COVID, not surprising. But they also used to get busted on 420 kind of frequently, right? So they kind of operate in this weird world where they would drive around the city, you knew they existed, they would come to events, and then about once or twice a year, the cops would just come up and bust them for all kinds of little petty misdemeanors that just made their life difficult. So that was kind of the gray market story. Then we have Initiative 300. You might remember in 2016, let's look at Wikipedia here, November of 2016, by 53% margin, Denver passed the Neighborhood Supported Cannabis Consumption Pilot Program. It was the first attempt to really legalize consumption programs in general. It allowed regular businesses, coffee shops, art galleries, entertainment venues, even yoga studios to seek permits for a bring your own marijuana over 21 consumption area. It allowed vaping and edibles indoor, but not smoking. If you had an outdoor area, you could allow some smoking. The Liquor Control Board quickly said that bars and restaurants could not apply for it. And in general, it was a pretty big failure. I believe there's one establishment in the entirety of Denver that underneath this Initiative 300 is possibly operating today, I believe. But in general, it didn't really work. And a big part of why it didn't work was because there was no real logical business model behind it, right? You couldn't sell weed. The setbacks meant you could only put it in very few places. You could try to sell food to people, but then you were a restaurant. The licenses said you couldn't do both those things. So it got... Initiative 300 was voter approved. It wasn't really designed very well by city council or anyone like that who deals with regulations in Denver. So it got the idea out there. I think there's one place that actually operates under an Initiative 300 license, but in general, it was kind of a failure. And one of the biggest reasons was just so many limits that came with it, right? If you couldn't smoke indoors, you couldn't vape indoors, you could sit inside and eat an edible and wait around for an hour for that to start to kick in, but it wasn't very friendly to how people wanted to consume cannabis. On top of that, the business model was pretty unclear. You couldn't sell cannabis, you couldn't sell food, you couldn't sell drinks, so you pretty much were limited to charging membership fees or something along those lines. So it just wasn't a very well set up system. So in 2019, the Colorado legislature explicitly allowed smoking cannabis indoors. And that's kind of a huge deal, right? Colorado Clean Air Act, like many clean air acts in lots of states around the country, was an attempt to get rid of smoking. If you're my age or older and not much younger than me, you probably remember that restaurants used to walk in, there was a smoking section and a non-smoking section, and that didn't work very well, right? The smoke would come over into the whole restaurant. And there was a big push in the 80s. Some of the people who wrote the op-ed that we're talking about here were involved in some of those pushes to get smoking banned from most public places. So for Colorado's legislature to go out of their way in 2019 and explicitly allow the smoking of cannabis indoors was a pretty huge piece. So we can actually take a look at how that went down here. This bill is called the Concerning Marijuana Hospitality Establishments and in connection therewith making an appropriation. So this was an explicit bill set up to try to make hospitality establishments a thing in Colorado. Our governor, Jared Polis, is very pro-cannabis. He thinks this can be a big tourist attraction. And in general, a lot of people talk about how if you're a tourist and you come to Colorado and you buy cannabis at a dispensary, there's really nowhere for you to consume it legally oftentimes. You can't smoke it in your car. You can't smoke it in a public place like a park. And unless you stay at a hotel that's explicitly going to allow that, and because of the Clean Air Act, they probably won't, you end up in this weird conundrum where you've bought the cannabis legally, and what are you supposed to do with it? Obviously, most people just probably go to a park and smoke it outdoors, and it doesn't necessarily mean a lot of them are getting arrested, but still, there shouldn't be this weird loophole, right? So in this state legislation, they added an exception to smoking restrictions. They said, Part I, if authorized by local ordinance, license, or regulation. Basically, they're saying that a marijuana hospitality business falls under the exceptions to smoking restrictions. And if you go over to the Colorado Code, you'll see that there's this exception to smoking restrictions. There's a few different places, and the very last one here is the cannabis exception. So in 2019, Colorado's legislature lifted that cap and said, if a local jurisdiction wants to allow people to smoke within a marijuana hospitality license, we're going to make an exception to that, and it won't be banned by the Colorado Clean Air Act. So let's go back to that op-ed now that we have a little more context on how that went down, and let's evaluate what their arguments are, basically. So the first one is that they say, if passed, the bill to enact marijuana hospitality program for Denver will bring marijuana smoking indoors to restaurants and other establishments. Well, let's get that out of the way real quick. It's not restaurants. That's not happening, all right? But yes, it can bring cannabis smoking indoors to establishments in Colorado. And the op-ed says, undoubtedly, allowing marijuana smoking or vaping in places where smoking and vaping is now prohibited will undermine the laws that protect the public from exposure to secondhand smoke and secondhand vapor. So they're pretty much just against this because they worked very hard in the 80s to get all inside smoking banned, and they just don't want those laws undermined, all right? So they're kind of fear-mongering with the restaurants part. That's not going to happen, but they are right to some extent that this is going to change those laws. The question that I have there is, who is the public that they're referring to, right? Back when you could smoke in regular restaurants, most restaurants allowed smoking, or a lot of them certainly did, and the public was anyone who wanted to go out to a restaurant. And that was a big part of why they pushed it. They said, if you're going to go to a restaurant, you shouldn't have to inhale smoke, right? That's not what you went to the restaurant for. But if you're looking at a cannabis smoking lounge, is that really the public? If I walk into a lounge that allows cannabis consumption and cannabis smoking, am I going to be shocked that I'm breathing in cannabis smoke? Am Am I part of the public at that point, or am I a customer, right? The second question is, are they looking at neighbors or people walking by the establishment? Well, if they are thinking of those kind of folks, then we can jump over here to the Denver draft. This is the bill that they're upset about here. You can see it's a draft that has not been passed yet. But here's what it says about smoking of marijuana indoors. So this is how they're complying with that state legislation. This is what the local jurisdiction of Denver is going to license their businesses to do. They say, marijuana smoking indoors and outdoors must occur in compliance with the odor control plan filed pursuant to Section 410 of this code and approved by the Department of Public Health and Environment. So let's keep that in mind, right? The Department of Public Health and the Department of the Environment are going to be involved in approving the odor control plan that each of these dispensaries, or not dispensaries, but consumption lounges will have to file with the city. And if we jump over to the state code here, we can see that this odor control plan, it applies to a lot of different types of businesses: pet food manufacturing, marijuana growing, processing, rendering, and meat byproducts. So what you don't see in here currently is this new language, that a marijuana hospitality business. But that's what this Denver code is going to change, that now if any person engages in a marijuana hospitality business, they will have to follow a odor control plan that basically says, we're not going to let people nearby even smell this into a nuisance level. So at this point, the public that you're referring to is either people walking into the cannabis lounge who should know what they're getting themselves into, or people who are nearby the cannabis lounge, in which case there's an odor control plan in place. They can call, file complaints. I'm feeling like I'm inhaling smoke in my backyard because I live near a cannabis lounge. If that's the case, the city has a system in place to deal with nuisance odors. So that doesn't seem to me like these laws are going to undermine protection of the public. So let's look at the next part here. They say, very simply, smoke is smoke. Secondhand marijuana smoke is a health hazard for non-smokers and smokers. There's now enough scientific evidence to affirm that secondhand marijuana smoke creates a serious health risk to the public. Okay, so yeah, research shows that smoke is smoke. And if you are late to hearing that inhaling smoke into your lungs is worse than not inhaling smoke into your lungs, I think maybe you've been asleep at the wheel a little bit. I think we all understand that inhaling smoke is not ideal for your lungs. However, the next question is cannabis smoke the same as cigarette smoke? No, research has shown very clearly that's not the case. I pulled this up after a quick Google search. The title of this research paper is "Cannabis and Tobacco Smoke Are Not Equally Carcinogenic." Now, happily, this actually was written by the biology department at the University of Colorado in Colorado Springs. I didn't look for a Colorado-specific source, but cool to find one. And basically, they are saying available scientific data that examines the carcinogenic properties of inhaling smoke and its biological consequences suggests reasons why tobacco smoke, but not cannabis smoke, may result in lung cancer. Now, the paper goes on into a lot more scientific terms, but look, at the end of the day, we know that inhaling smoke into your lungs irritates your lungs. It can irritate your cardiovascular system, but it's not going to give you lung cancer. And certainly it's not going to come anywhere close to giving you the problems that cigarette smoke does. Of all kinds of different cancer, emphysemas, stuff like that. Why? You can read this article, this research paper if you want. But basically, nicotine exacerbates it. There's a lot more chemicals in cigarettes than there are in cannabis, especially regulated legal cannabis. And at the end of the day, they just are not comparable. So this argument that smoke is smoke and secondhand marijuana smoke is a health hazard, true, but all the arguments that we made in the 1980s to get rid of smoking in public of cigarettes is just not the same. And that's something that we constantly have to push back on as a cannabis industry. We're not going to sit out here and pretend that inhaling smoke in your lungs is a positive thing for your lungs. They might get irritated. They might make you cough. Maybe it's something you want to move away from as you explore other ways to consume cannabis. But don't try to come tell us that we're doing the same thing or we're reversing all the progress that's been made against cigarettes. It's simply not the same issue. Moving on to their next, the last thing they mention in here, once they've kind of mentioned the public and they've mentioned just sheer, smoke is smoke and it's bad, now they're saying the last thing we need is to create a new class of workers that would have to sacrifice their health for a paycheck. Okay, fair enough. Look, I'm generally in favor of workers' rights, and I want to pause for a moment and think about whether they've convinced me with this argument. And the first thing we have to ask ourselves is what is the role of the government in an employment contract, right? When it comes to things like minimum wage, people with more liberal viewpoints, such as myself, we generally say we're not okay with a business finding an employee that's willing to work for $1 an hour. We say, no, the government should come in and force the business to pay a little more than that, right? So minimum wage is a way that the government interferes in an employment contract. Protection from harassment is another one, right? Your boss can't just say to you, well, I'm your boss and you agreed to work here, and part of the conditions of working here is that I get to harass you, whether that's sexually or any other type of harassment. We understand the government has a role to say, no, you as an employee, when you take a job, you're not signing up for whatever abuse that the owner or your manager wants to throw at you, right? So this is another opportunity where we say we want the government to step in and protect workers, that even though they're taking a job, they're not signing all their rights away, right? So then we have to move on to a second part of the question, right? What qualifies as something that you should expect as an employee? It's kind of part of the job. And what doesn't fall under that, right? So we know that you shouldn't expect that being emotionally abused is part of the job, or physically abused is part of the job, right? If you have a physical disability, you should not have the employer be able to discriminate against you for that. However, if your job is to lift heavy objects, we accept that the employer does have a reason to force that on you, right? Same with something, obviously, if you work in an office, your manager can't tell you how to dress necessarily, or Now, if you come into an office and your boss tells you that they want you to dress in a more revealing way, we accept that the government should step in and you can probably sue your boss or something like that. However, if you work at a strip club, we accept that dressing in a more revealing way is probably part of your job. And when you signed up for that job, you accepted the conditions that is part of what the job requires, right? So there's some nuance here. When it comes to smoking, we look at restaurants. In the 1980s or 90s, when they got rid of smoking in restaurants, a big argument was when you sign up to be a server or a chef or whatever, it shouldn't be part of the job that you have to breathe cigarette smoke all day long. And that was a big part of the government stepping in and saying, we're going to ban smoking in these indoor establishments because breathing in cigarette smoke, the hazards, the health concerns that come with that, we're not going to accept that that's just part of the job, right? Meanwhile, if we look at cigar lounges, the government might say a cigar lounge needs to ventilate to a certain extent, but if you take a job at a cigar lounge, you accept that people might be smoking cigars inside the establishment, and you can't sue your boss and say that that's a danger to your health because you kind of accepted that when you took the job, right? When we're looking at these cannabis smoking lounges, aren't we pretty okay with the idea that if you're an employee at a cannabis consumption lounge, you probably knew that you were signing up for being around cannabis smoke? I think that that's an okay assumption to make. I don't think that that is asking workers to give up too many of their rights. I'm not saying that if you work at a restaurant, you should just put up with it. We're a smoking restaurant. No, I think that that's wrong. I think that if you work at a cigar lounge, you probably tolerate it. You probably accept that that's part of the risk involved. And similarly, I think that when it comes to cannabis lounges, we can safely say that employees understand that. So in general, here's my conclusions. Number one, their complaint is actually with Colorado, not Denver, right? So they're kind of late to the game here and they're jumping on Denver's proposal. But as we already looked at, this is something that is an exception to smoking restrictions if authorized by local ordinance, but it's in the state code. So I don't know what they were doing in 2019 when this passed the state code, but that's really who they need to be going to argue with. And they're a little late to that, unfortunately. Second of all, the health risks are vastly different. I'm not going to sit here and say there's no risk to breathing in cannabis smoke or secondhand cannabis smoke, but let's not pretend that it's the same as cigarettes or that all the arguments that were used in the 90s to get cigarettes out of public restaurants is the same arguments that apply today to cannabis smoke. It's just not the same. And lastly, employees know what they're getting into, all right? When they sign up for a job to work at a cannabis consumption lounge, I think that they're okay with being around cannabis consumption. Similarly, we could say the public knows what they're getting themselves into. If you walk into a cannabis consumption lounge, you understand that that's a place where cannabis will be consumed and you will be around some smoke. So my personal feeling is that I disagree pretty strongly with this op-ed in the Colorado Sun. I think that while possibly well-intentioned, that they are just throwing up roadblocks for something that's a good idea that Denver and Colorado have thought about for a long time. And I think this op-ed is not going to work. But I applaud the writers for all the public health advocacy that they have done over the years. I think they got this one wrong. So tell me what you think. Leave a comment below. I really appreciate it. Love to engage with you and hear some more feedback. And again, if you like this video, if you're interested in the cannabis industry and talking about the issues that are arising more and more these days as we legalize in more states and probably at the federal level soon, give a like to the video, subscribe below. I really appreciate it. Again, it's Mike Hayes here in Colorado.